There lived a man named Teo. He was the Crimson Tide, the undisputed boss of the Dragonhead Syndicate. His heart was a fortress of ice, and his word was law in every gambling den and shipyard in the city. He lived in a skyscraper of glass, surrounded by guards who feared his silence more than his shout. He was a king with no crown, ruling a world of gray. Then, on a Tuesday that smelled of salt and impending storms, a girl named Yuna walked into his private lounge. She was a simple tailor's assistant, delivering a custom-made silk suit. She stood small against the marble pillars, clutching the garment bag like a shield. As she reached out to hand it to him, her cuff caught on the table's edge. Teo's eyes, usually as cold as the deep ocean, suddenly locked onto her forearm. There, against her pale skin, were the ugly yellow-purple marks of a heavy hand. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Teo didn't blink. He didn't move a muscle. His gaze remained pinned to the bruises on Yuna's arm. She gasped, realizing her sleeve had fallen, and tried to tuck her arm behind her back. "I'm sorry, Chairman," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. "It was a mistake. I'll go." But Teo moved with the speed of a striking viper. He caught her wrist, firmly, but without causing pain. He stood up, towering over her, and the tension in the room spiked. His personal guards, led by a scarred man named Jin Huck, stepped forward, sensing the shift in their master's energy. Teo ignored them. He looked into Yuna's eyes and saw a deep, hollow exhaustion. He saw a girl who had been broken and mended too many times. He looked at Jin Huck and gave a single, sharp tilt of his head. "Don't move," Teo told Yuna. It wasn't a request. It was a command to the universe. He turned to Jin Huck. "Lock the entire building. Seal every exit. Nobody breathes without my permission." The heavy steel shutters of the skyscraper slammed shut with a thunderous boom that vibrated through the floor. The electronic locks engaged, turning the luxury tower into an impenetrable vault. Yuna's breath hitched. She looked at the armed men guarding the elevators and felt like a trapped bird. "Please," she choked out, "my mother, she needs her medicine. I have to get back to the shop." Teo didn't speak. He led her to a leather armchair and sat her down as if she were made of thin glass. He knelt on the floor before her, a sight that would have turned his rival's blood to water. The king of Busan was on his knees. He gently pulled her sleeve all the way up, revealing a series of finger-shaped marks that wrapped around her bicep. They were fresh, angry, and cruel. Teo traced the edge of a bruise with a calloused finger, and Yuna flinched, a tiny sob escaping her. Teo's jaw turned to stone. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a predator who had found a scent he hated. He looked up at her. "Who did this, Yuna?" Yuna shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It's okay. I fell. Please just let me go." She tried to pull away, but Teo's grip was a silent anchor. He knew that lie. He had heard it from 1,000 victims in the underworld. He knew the look of someone living under a shadow. "In the city of Busan, there are many types of pain," Teo said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "But this pain belongs to someone who thinks they own you. In this building, however, I own the air you breathe, and I am telling you, you are safe." He stood and turned to Jin Huck, who stood like a statue by the door. "Bring me the footage from the tailor shop street for the last 48 hours, and run a check on every debt collector and lowlife in the East District. I want a name, a home address, and a list of everyone he loves by the time the clock strikes the hour." Jin Huck bowed and vanished. Teo turned back to Yuna, handing her a silk handkerchief. "Is it a man named Sangwoo?" The name Sangwoo hit Yuna like a physical blow. She recoiled, her face draining of all color. Sangwoo was a predator of a different kind, a loan shark who preyed on the desperate, a man who enjoyed the fear he caused. He said he would burn the shop," Yuna sobbed, her composure finally shattering. "He said if I didn't give him the keys to the warehouse, he would make sure my mother never woke up." The room seemed to grow colder as she spoke. Teo felt a familiar heat rising in his gut. Not the chaotic heat of anger, but the precise, white-hot heat of an executioner. Sangwoo was a cockroach who had crawled into Teo's garden. Teo walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the harbor. The ships sat still in the dark water, unaware of the storm he was about to unleash. He tapped the glass twice. "Jin-Huk." The door opened instantly. "Sir, the building remains locked. Guard her with your life. If a single hair on her head is disturbed, I will pull this city apart stone by stone." Yuna watched the elevator doors close on Teo. The man she had seen before, the tired businessman, was gone. In his place was the Crimson Tide, a force that could drown a city. "Where's he going?" she asked one of the guards. The man didn't look at her, but his voice was respectful. "The boss is going to collect a debt, miss." Yuna sat back, the silence of the penthouse wrapping around her. She felt like she was in a golden cage, but for the first time in years, the cage felt like a sanctuary. She looked at her arm, where the bruises were a grim reminder of why she was here. She thought of Teo's eyes. They weren't kind, but they were honest. He had seen her suffering and hadn't looked away. He had treated her pain as something that mattered. She looked out at the city lights and prayed. She knew Sangwoo was a coward, but cowards were often the most dangerous when cornered. She wondered if she had just traded a small demon for a god of destruction. The elevator reached the underground garage. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and anticipation. Teo stepped out, adjusting the gold links on his cuffs. He wasn't wearing his jacket, just a black dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. Behind him, 50 men stood by black SUVs, their faces masked in shadow. No words were needed. The Gemsaw Syndicate was moving. They hadn't mobilized like this in 5 years, since the Great Pier War. The city thought Teo had grown soft, that he was too busy with real estate to remember how to bleed. They were about to learn that a lion doesn't forget how to hunt. It just waits for a reason to kill. Teo climbed into the lead car. "The East District docks," he said. The fleet of cars roared to life, a black serpent winding through the neon streets of Busan. Teo looked at his phone. A photo of Sangwoo appeared, a greasy man with a smug smile. Teo swiped the screen black. "Drive faster," he whispered. The East District was a graveyard of rusting cranes and rotting wood. Sangwoo sat in a makeshift office inside an old shipping container, counting dirty stacks of won. He felt powerful. He had Yuna under his thumb, and soon he would have the warehouse. He didn't hear the cars. He didn't hear the silence of the stray dogs fleeing the area. Suddenly, the metal door of the container was ripped off its hinges with a scream of tortured steel. Sangwoo jumped, his money scattering like dead leaves. "What the—" He stopped. Standing in the doorway was Teo, framed by the moonlight and the red glow of the harbor lights. Behind him stood a wall of men in black. Sangwoo's bravado vanished, replaced by a cold, wet fear that traveled down his spine. "Chairman Teo," he stammered, "this is a surprise. I didn't know you cared about this district." Teo walked into the small space, his boots crunching on the loose bills. He didn't look at the money, he only looked at Sangwoo's hands. The meeting was short and terrifying. Teo didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He grabbed Sangwoo by the throat and pinned him against the corrugated metal wall. The sound of the impact echoed like a drum. "You touched something that didn't belong to you," Teo said. His voice was so quiet, it was almost a caress. Sangwoo clawed at Teo's arm, his face turning a deep shade of plum. "It's just a girl. She owed money." Teo's grip tightened. "She owes nothing. The world owes her a debt for having to look at your face." He slammed Sangwoo's head against the wall once, twice. The sound of breaking bone filled the container. "Where is the medicine you took from her mother?" Teo asked. Sangwoo pointed a shaking finger at a shelf. Teo took the small bag of vials and tucked it into his pocket. Then he leaned in close, his eyes glowing like embers. "If you ever breathe her name again, I won't kill you. I will make sure you live forever in a place where you can never see the sun." Teo stepped out of the container. His men were already loading Sangwoo and his thugs into the back of a van. They would be taken to the deep water, far beyond the harbor lights, and told never to return to Busan. Teo stood by the water's edge, the salt spray hitting his face. He felt the adrenaline beginning to fade, replaced by a strange, heavy warmth. He thought of Yuna waiting in his penthouse. He had spent his life building a kingdom of fear, but tonight he had used that fear for something good. He looked at the bag of medicine in his hand. It was a small thing, but it felt heavier than all the gold in his vault. "Jinhik," he called out, "burn the container. I want this place erased." He got back into his car and leaned his head against the cool leather. "Take me home," he said. He didn't mean the penthouse. He meant the place where Yuna was. Back at the skyscraper, the locks hissed as they disengaged. The elevators hummed back to life. Yuna stood by the window, watching the rain stop and the first hint of gray light touch the horizon. When the doors opened, Teo walked in. He looked weary, his shirt stained with grease and a drop of blood on his collar. He didn't say a word. He walked across the room and placed the bag of medicine on the table in front of her. Yuna's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the labels. "You got it back," she whispered. Teo nodded. He looked at her bruises, which seemed less angry in the soft morning light. "The man who hurt you is gone. He will not return." Yuna stood up and walked toward him. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She reached out and touched the blood on his collar. "You're hurt," she said. Teo looked down at her. "It's not mine," he replied. They stood there in the quiet of the high-rise, two people from different worlds, linked by a night of violence and a strange, sudden grace. Yuna stayed in the penthouse for 3 days, while Teo's doctors treated her mother and secured her shop. Teo didn't ask for anything in return. He barely spoke to her, but he was always there, a silent shadow in the corner of the room, watching over her. On the 4th day, he told her she was free to go. "I have bought the buildings on either side of your shop," he said. "My men will be stationed there permanently. You will never see them, but they will see everything." Yuna looked at the man who had turned his world upside down for her. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Teo looked at the horizon. "Because for one moment, when I saw you, I remembered what it was like to be human. I remembered that some things are worth more than power." He handed her a small gold key. "If the shadows ever return, use this. It opens the private door to this building. I will always be waiting." Yuna took the key, her fingers brushing his. She realized then that she wasn't just leaving a fortress, she was leaving a part of her heart behind. The months passed and Busan changed. The news spoke of a massive shift in the underworld. The Dragonhead Syndicate had stopped its aggressive expansion. Teo was seen less and less in the clubs and more in the quiet gardens of the city. His rivals whispered that he had lost his edge, that he was a king who had forgotten his crown. But they were wrong. Teo was stronger than ever, because he finally had something to lose. Every morning, a single lily was delivered to his office from a small tailor shop in the East District. He never thanked her, and she never sent a note. It was a silent conversation between the shadow and the light. But in the underworld, peace is a fragile thing. A new power was rising in the north, a group that didn't care for the old codes of Busan. They saw Teo's quietness as a weakness, and they decided to test the Crimson Tide. They decided to strike at the one thing the shadow cared about. One evening, as the sun dipped below the ocean, the gold key turned in the lock of Teo's private elevator. He was sitting in the dark, watching the city when the doors opened. Yuna stepped out, but she wasn't the same girl he had seen months ago. Her dress was torn and her face was pale with terror. She didn't speak. She just held out her hand. There, on her wrists, were new marks, not bruises this time, but the red welts of a rope. Teo stood up, and the temperature in the room plummeted. The ice had returned to his heart, but this time it was laced with fire. "Who?" he whispered. Yuna collapsed into his arms. "They came from the north," she sobbed. "They killed the guards. They told me to tell you that the tide is going to turn red." Teo held her, his grip like iron. He looked at Jinhyuk, who had appeared at the sound of the elevator. "Call the elders. Tell them the war they've been waiting for is here. And tell them I am not fighting for the city. I am fighting for the soul of it." The war for Busan was not fought in the streets, but in the shadows. Teo moved like a ghost, striking with a brutality that shocked even his oldest lieutenants. He dismantled the northern invaders piece by piece, house by house. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat. He was a man possessed. He kept Yuna in the penthouse, the building locked down more tightly than ever before. He transformed the luxury tower into a war room. Every time he returned from a raid, he would go to her room just to hear her breathe. It was the only thing that kept him from becoming a monster. One night, he returned covered in the dust of a demolished warehouse. He found Yuna waiting for him with a basin of warm water. She didn't say anything as she began to wash the grime from his hands. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice raspy. She looked up at him, her eyes steady. "You are fighting for me. Let me care for you." As the final battle approached, the northern leader, a man known as the Butcher, sent a message. He wanted a meeting at the old lighthouse at the edge of the city. He promised to leave Busan if Teo met him alone. It was a trap, and everyone knew it. Jin-hyuk begged Teo not to go. "It's a suicide mission, boss. Let us take them out from the rooftops." But Teo looked at Yuna, who was watching from the doorway. He knew that as long as the Butcher lived, she would never be safe. The cycle of violence had to end with the source. "I'm going," Teo said. He went to Yuna and took the gold key from around her neck. "If I am not back by dawn, Jin-hyuk will take you to the airport. There is a plane waiting. Go to Switzerland. Never look back." Yuna grabbed his hand. "Come back to me. Don't let the shadows win." Teo kissed her, a hard, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and goodbye. "I will find the light," he promised. The lighthouse stood like a lonely tooth against the raging sea. Teo walked toward it, his long coat flapping in the wind. He was alone, or so it seemed. The Butcher was waiting at the top, surrounded by 20 men. "The great Teo," the man sneered, "reduced to a hero for a girl." Teo didn't respond. He reached the base of the stairs and began to climb. Every step was a memory. Of the bruises on Yuna's arm, of the lilies on his desk, of the way her hand felt in his. He reached the top and stood before the invaders. "Kill him," the Butcher ordered. But the shadows of the lighthouse suddenly came alive. Jin-hyuk and his elite team, who had been scaled the walls in the dark, burst through the windows. The small space turned into a slaughterhouse. Teo moved through the chaos, his eyes fixed only on the Butcher. He caught the man at the edge of the railing. "The tide doesn't turn," Teo whispered. "It just washes the filth away." He pushed. Teo stood at the top of the lighthouse, watching the body of his enemy vanish into the churning waves below. The wind tore at his hair, and the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon. He was bleeding from a dozen cuts, and his body ached with a fatigue that went down to his soul. But the air felt clean. He looked back at the city, where the lights of his skyscraper were still glowing. He had done it. The North was broken, and his kingdom was secure. But he didn't want the kingdom anymore. He looked at Jin-hyuk, who was breathing hard beside him. "It's over," Teo said. "Give the men the signal. We are stepping down. All of us." Jin-hyuk looked shocked. "But boss, the city is yours." Teo shook his head. "I don't want the city. I want a life." He began the long walk down the stairs, each step lighter than the last. He was going back to the only person who saw the man behind the shadow. When Teo reached the penthouse, the sun was fully up, casting gold streaks across the marble floors. He found Yuna standing by the elevator, her bags packed just as he had ordered. When she saw him, she let out a cry that was half sob, half laugh. She ran to him and he caught her, lifting her off her feet despite his wounds. "You're back," she whispered into his neck. "I'm back," he said. He looked around the cold, expensive room and realized it had never been a home. It was just a high-altitude prison. "We're leaving, Yuna, not to Switzerland, to somewhere where no one knows the name Teo." They left that morning, taking nothing but each other. They drove south, away from the neon and the noise, toward the quiet villages where the mountains meet the sea. Teo learned to fish from the local men, who only knew him as a quiet giant with scarred hands. Yuna opened a small tailor shop in the village square, where she made dresses that flowed like the ocean. They lived a life of simple rhythms: the tide, the sun, the scent of sewing oil and salt. For the first year, Teo still jumped at the sound of a car door slamming. He still slept with a knife under his pillow. But slowly, the ice melted. The nightmares of Busan faded, replaced by the reality of Yuna's laugh. He realized that peace wasn't the absence of war. It was the presence of something worth protecting. He would sit on their porch in the evenings, watching Yuna work, and marvel at the fact that he was allowed to be happy. He was a ghost who had finally found a body. One day, a black car, too clean and too expensive for the village, pulled up to the pier. Teo, who was mending a net, felt his heart skip. The old instinct flared. He stood up, his long frame blocking the sun. A man stepped out wearing a suit that looked out of place in the dust. It was Jinyuk. He walked toward Teo and stopped 3 paces away. He didn't bow as a subordinate. He nodded as a friend. "The city is quiet," Jinyuk said. "The new families are fighting over the scraps, but they've forgotten about you. I made sure the records were unplaced." Teo looked at the scarred man who had been his shadow for a decade. "Why are you here, Jinyuk?" The scarred man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, dried lily. "I just wanted to see if the garden was still growing." He looked toward the house, where Yuna was waving from the window. "It is," Teo said, a rare smile touching his lips. "It is." Jin-hyuk stayed for dinner. They sat on the porch eating grilled fish and drinking local wine. They didn't talk about the wars or the blood. They talked about the weather and the price of silk. When it was time for Jin-hyuk to leave, he handed Teo a small wooden box. "A gift from the men who were left," he said. Teo opened it. Inside was the gold key he had given Yuna, now polished and set into a simple pendant. "You don't need to open doors anymore," Jin-hyuk said, "but we wanted you to remember that you saved us too. You showed us there was a way out." Teo watched the black car disappear back toward the highway. He felt a final tether to his old life snap, but it didn't hurt. He walked back inside and hung the pendant around Yuna's neck. "For the doors we've closed," he whispered. She smiled and kissed his cheek. "And for the ones we've opened." Years passed, and the legend of the Crimson Tide became a campfire story in Busan, a tale of a man who vanished into the mist to protect a girl. Some said he was dead, others said he was a king in hiding. But in the small village by the sea, there was only a man who loved his wife. Teo's hands were no longer stained with ink and blood, but with the earth of the garden he built for Yuna. He grew lilies of every color, white, gold, and deep sunset red. One evening, Yuna's mother, who lived in the cottage next door, sat with them. She looked at Teo, who was teaching a local child how to tie a sailor's knot. "You have a good heart, Teo," she said. Teo looked at Yuna, who was silhouetted against the rising moon. "I didn't always," he said, "but I had a very good teacher." He realized that his life had been a long, dark tunnel, and Yuna had been the light at the end of it. He had locked a building to save her, but she had unlocked his soul to save him. As Teo grew older, the strength in his arms faded, but the light in his eyes grew brighter. He and Yuna would walk along the beach every morning, their footprints filling with water and then vanishing, just like the memories of their past. The bruises that had started it all were long gone, replaced by the soft wrinkles of a life well lived. Sometimes he would see a flash of a black suit in the village, a guardian sent by Jin-hyuk to watch from afar, and he would simply nod. He wasn't afraid anymore. He knew that the world was full of shadows, but he also knew that even the smallest candle could hold them at bay. He looked at Yuna, who was collecting shells in the surf. She looked back and waved, her face radiant. He thought back to that rainy night in Busan, to the moment he saw her bruises and felt the world tilt. He realized that every act of violence he had committed was a waste, and every act of love was a victory. On their 50th anniversary, the village threw a feast. There were flowers everywhere, and the smell of roasting meat filled the air. Teo stood at the head of the table, looking at the generations of people he had come to know. He saw the children he had taught, the men he had fished with, and the woman who had changed his destiny. He raised a glass of wine, his hand steady. "To the bruises that heal," he said, his voice clear and strong, "and to the doors that never need to be locked again." The village cheered, and the sound echoed up into the mountains and out over the sea. In the distance, the lights of a passing ship flickered, a reminder of the world they had left behind. But Teo didn't look back. He took Yuna's hand and together they walked toward their home, a place of light, lilies, and lasting peace. The boss was gone, the girl was safe, and the story was finally beautifully complete.